Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Wood. I'm the Director of Programs for the Start and Scale team here at Communitech. I'd like to welcome you all to today's Ask Me Anything session on market diversification and growth in uncertain times. Just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items before we kick off today's session. So just as a reminder, today's session is being recorded. We have all of our past Ask Me Anything sessions located on our website, communitech.ca, for companies to refer back to and use as an ongoing resource. We also ask that you please keep your microphone on mute throughout today's session. And if you do have questions for any of our panelists or moderator, please use the chat feature to ask those questions. Or because we do have a small group today, you can also use the raise hand feature under reactions at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. So Ali, who's moderating today's session, will see your hand and invite you to unmute to ask your question. So those are the two options. We do have some slides to go over to kind of kickstart today, and then we will be opening it up for discussion and questions. And lastly, the session is meant to provide general guidance. However, if you do want to further discuss a topic one-on-one with any of our panelists or today's host, please reach out to Azar on our team, who will also be speaking today, or your Communitech CSM or advisor, and they'll be happy to get you connected. And we can put those email addresses in today's chat for you as well. We have two upcoming Ask Me Anything sessions. So next week, getting started in the wild world of digital marketing, followed by managing your investor pipeline. So please feel free to join us for those sessions if they're relevant to you. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Ali, today's host, to get us started for introductions with today's panelists.
Okay, great. Thank you, Christina. Many thanks, Christina. And I just start by thanking yourself and Azar for inviting us to be here to be part of this conversation. I'm hearing a lot of good things about your session on monthly and ongoing basis. So we are very happy to be part of the conversation that you have with your community. And hopefully we can bring some new ideas and some new lesson learned from others that we worked with to this conversation. My name is Ali Lajavardi. I'm the Regional Director for Business Development of BDC Advisory in Ontario. We have a team that is really focusing on small, medium-sized businesses and entrepreneurs. And our role in the market, for those of you that may not be familiar with BDC that much, is really to be a connector, to be a help for you to expedite your growth, to get your vision and convert them to realities. And hopefully through the process, we get the opportunity to help you through some financing tools or some advice through the colleagues that we have across the bank and across the region. Today, we are here to discuss a little bit of international expansion. It's one of the areas that we are very passionate about. It's one of the areas that we think and talk about a lot about. And we have a team that is dedicated to that side of the business. In our conversations, and I go through a quick introduction of my colleagues, I ask them to introduce themselves when they start to share their thoughts. That one of the things that we hear a lot when it comes to international expansion is the relationship between a strategy, international strategy and corporate strategy, with the talent, and then the ways that getting those strategies into operational levels. Many companies have desires to grow, and in many cases, international expansion is one of the areas that fits nicely to the strategy. The challenges that we see time to time is that it's a little bit harder to reach out to different markets. Sometimes you don't know the market at the local level. Sometimes they have different languages, different cultures, and different perspectives that we need to learn as we go and expand to those markets. So we want to take you through a little bit of a journey here, from a strategy to the talent and to how to approach international expansion. We start with talent acquisition and management, and Communitech has a fantastic program, outpost program, that I've seen some of my clients benefiting from this program, and is a way to get to the new markets, find talent, manage talent, and de-risk all that process. I will ask Azar to share some context with us on that. Then we go to Glenn Yanomitsu, my colleague, who's heading what we call high impact firms in Ontario. And high impact firms in our language are the firms that are growing faster than their peers in the market. They have ambition to grow and be one of the global players, and really be a game changer in their space, in their market, and in many cases create new markets. And then William Ploshin, my colleague, he's an expert in international business, is going to share some ideas with us around international expansion, the steps to take or not to take based on your product and services. And we try to go a little bit deeper into European market and different aspects of the European market. So this is your session. Please feel free to stop us, to make your comment, to ask your questions on chat box, or just put your hands up. We come to you and we listen to what you have to share, and we try to add some insight or kind of lessons that we learn from your peers in the market. With that, maybe Azar, I pass it back to yourself to talk about the talent and outpost piece at the beginning, and then we jump into the rest of it. Take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ali. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. Glenn, could I ask you to stop sharing your screen and I'll just share mine? Thank you. All right, can I get a thumbs up if you see the outpost screen here? Fantastic. So hi everyone, my name is Azar Janjua. I am the head of the Communitech Outpost program here at Communitech. And just wanted to give a really quick overview. We're talking about international expansion, and at Communitech and partnering with BDC, we've got a great program that helps de-risk that global expansion journey for you and help you put boots on the ground overseas before you've invested in the infrastructure of building out companies. So really simply, what we are is an employer of record service that gives you access to hire talent in over 160 countries using our entities or our network of entities that are in country. We help you get boots on the ground in a few weeks. We have made this program available to all business sectors across Canada. We're working with companies from Newfoundland to Vancouver. No Communitech membership is required. And our role is really to help you understand HR issues and payroll issues globally. And we help take the hassle out of employment contracts. We give HR support. We handle the payroll and compliance. In the US, we set up a 401k program. In the UK, we have a pension program and health benefits around the world. So that being said, that allows your operations team to focus less on the back end of how do I hire and pay that person, and more on your sales and driving your solution and your company forward. Value prop is really straightforward. When you want to hire people outside of Canada, your team will have to set up a company. You'll have to get lawyers and accountants and banks. It will take your team 6 months to think about it, 6 months to execute it, and then another 6 months to set up the foreign bank account, which is great. We want to give you the time to be able to grow the region and move on and do that. But for the time being, if you want to set up your first sales office, your first operations office, marketing office in any given country, we can help you get set up in just a few weeks. And the idea being that we can help do this by reducing your risk and heavily reducing the costs involved in setting up and turning on that region. As I mentioned before, we are in 160 countries around the world. Hopefully you'll see the countries that you're interested in on this list. It's a pretty exhaustive list. And what we're seeing is a few trends. Obviously, this particular year, we're seeing a lot of growth in Germany, in France, in Singapore, and in Japan. And another thing that we're seeing a lot of is different use cases that have emerged out of the recovery from COVID. One, of course, is there's a lot of companies that are taking advantage of the fact they have a remote team. And now when resumes are coming in, you're open to look at the best talent from wherever they come from. They don't necessarily need to be in your city anymore. So that's one thing that's happening a lot. Another thing that's happening a lot is we want to take advantage of growth in different countries as they are recovering out of COVID. So it's great to put salespeople now in New Zealand and Australia, throughout Europe, as they recover faster. And we can help open up that market in a few weeks. And then the final thing that we're seeing a lot of is there are employees that are, Ontario residents or Canadian residents that have decided they no longer want to live in Canada. They would like to live in a different country. So now companies can make a business decision to decide, well, maybe I want to keep that employee. And now that they are in Portugal or in Poland or in Kenya, we can still keep that employee on our roster, and we can now compliantly hire them and pay them through the Communitech Outpost program. So these are really cool, unique ways that we're able to help companies. So I'll kind of leave it at that. For us at Outpost, we're really easy to get a hold of. Call us at outpost@communitech.ca, and happy to support. I'll hand it back to Ali.
Thank you, Azar. Yeah, no, and I really like the last piece you shared, the fact that if your employees decide to go somewhere else and live somewhere, this is a great service to keep a relationship, to keep the knowledge in the organization, and then move it to the next level. It is a very flexible program, and is definitely an area to expand on. So we touch on the strategy and the relationship of corporate strategy and larger strategy context with international expansion. One of the areas that we really work with companies is around strategy, leadership, and what it means for an organization that's growing fast, what it means for an organization that is going to set the trends, not to just follow the trends. And Glenn Yanomitsu, my colleague here, is one of the individuals that is very involved with those type of companies. We have a very limited number of those companies. I don't know the latest number, Glenn, maybe 100, 140 at this point, that we are working closely with the management and leadership of these companies to get them to the global stage and to get them to the levels that they can compete and grow at that level. So with that, Glenn, I pass it to yourself. If you can just do a quick introduction of yourself, the program, and then jump into what we have to share here, please.
Hey, fantastic. Thanks, Ali, and hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure here and a privilege to actually be collaborating with Ali, my colleague, and William, my colleague in Montreal, because we've done a lot of talking back and forth over time, and it's great to be able to work on a project like this. We've gone through a crazy period over the last 14 months. And, you know, no matter how experienced you are, no matter what kind of advisors you have, my guess is that you haven't experienced anything like this when the economies of Canada, the US, Europe, all shut down at the same time. How do you make decisions on strategy when you don't know the rules of the game? Or as the leader of your business, how do you allocate scarce resources like people, money, capital, when you don't know the possible returns from each of your growth options? Or what happens if the rules of the game change tomorrow? Yet in every sector, in every industry, every time there's a slowdown, the majority of companies take the cut in their growth curve, in their revenue curve, they take it bang on. But there's maybe one or two companies that seem to be the market leaders, that they look for opportunities when the market turns. I call those market makers. And we want to spend some time speaking to you about some of the best practices that they do and how you could implement these at your company so that you can maximize your returns and minimize your risk. So over the next 45 minutes, William and I will share the premise that some companies know how to find opportunities in the midst of uncertainty. And when everyone else sees gloom and doom, these companies see opportunity. So we'll talk about two things today. I'll start off talking about the strategic reasons to expand internationally. And then William will talk about a very specific area and opportunity for you. And that's about CETA and the EU. And William will talk more about that when he takes over, and he'll talk about some of his background and why he believes that these are some great opportunities. Oops. So even before March of 2020, when the COVID pandemic hit us, you know, we spent a lot of time with our clients discussing how the business and social environment keeps changing and how business leaders, especially the ones who want to win and lead, need to watch how the external environment changes, as that impacts the rules of the game, the opportunities that exist, and how you compete. Hey, we're in Canada, so let me give you an analogy. It's like a football game. And our friends in the South, the Americans, play tons of football. They think they know the game. Yet when they come up to play in the CFL, if they simply assume that they know the game, they'll be the first ones who lose. You see, in the US, a football field's 100 yards long and 53 yards wide. The game consists of 4 downs. The goalposts are in the end zone, 10 yards behind the goal line, and the end zone's 10 yards deep. Finally, there are 11 players on the field. But if you come up here and assume that you know the rules or the environment, you might be surprised to see a 110-yard long field or end zones that are 25 yards deep. Or why are the goalposts right on the goal line? And hold on, I thought we had 4 downs, but they only play with 3. And hey, there's an extra man on the field there. There's a 12th man. And if you didn't know these changes, imagine a quarterback. He looks downfield for a pass, and all of a sudden the 12th man pops up and intercepts the ball. Well, if you take that analogy and apply it to business in the post-pandemic world is no different. Things have changed. The rules are different. Companies who assume that they can figure it out, continue business as is post-pandemic, might make the odd mistake or two. The companies who are the leaders, the market makers, they have done the work to figure out the changes. They've determined how they should compete, how they should change their value prop, and how they should deploy the resources. So they're actually changing the game. The companies who follow will be surprised. Consider Amazon. We all know Amazon uses couriers to get, or package delivery companies to get packages to us. But I'm going to tell you about a service they have so they're no longer dependent on regular couriers. The expense is too high and the demand's too great. So they have their own drivers now, kind of like Uber, but it's Uber for delivery with Amazon. You go onto an app, you enter the number of hours and when you could drive. You enter in the model of car and right down to I have a Honda Accord EX. You go to their warehouse. The packages that you're supposed to deliver are assigned for you. They tell you how to pack the car, where to put each box. Because when you get in your car, the app will tell you in what order to deliver them because they've analyzed the traffic patterns. They tell you which route to take. And where the logistics companies thought they had Amazon right where they wanted them, Amazon used something like this to reduce their dependence on per later FedEx or UPS. So when we start strategic planning work, we start with the objectives, obviously, of the shareholder and CEO. But once we do this, the first thing we look at is the environment. And specifically, we look at global megatrends. Global megatrends are macroeconomic and geostrategic forces that shape our world and our futures. The implications of these forces are broad and varied. They impact some industries or companies more than others, but they might also present us with tremendous opportunities to seize if we see how these things happen and we could avoid dangerous risks. Their macro force is so big that there's nothing that we can do that will ever change them. They impact everything in our lives. So we need to strategize around them or we'll be crushed by them. So if we go back to our football example, imagine if in 1 year, the CFL changes its rules to only allow a certain number of American football players to be on a team. If you didn't know that, it'll probably change the way that you recruit players. Well, I know that happened, in fact, And so the general managers who were ahead of the game were able to strategize around it. So take it back to the megatrends. For today, we've selected 4 megatrends that we're going to quickly chat about. And we'll chat about whether that impacts your company or not. And if it doesn't, no worries, let's move on to the next. But if it does, then how do you need to change your strategy, your value prop, how you deliver your value prop to your clients or your customers so that you win? So let's first start with trade dynamics. You know, for the last 20 years, there's been a lot of countries negotiating freer trade. And freer trade allows us for comparative advantage. So the key thing here is we don't need to produce everything we need. By engaging in international trade, we could specialize in what we do best. And then we let our trading partner do what they do best. And if we trade, we're each better off because each of us gets better products at a better price. And ultimately, we all win. So Canada has taken it one step further. Canada has negotiated 14 free trade agreements with different countries or regions, and there's 14 more agreements in the works. So think about if one sector has been protected with duties and tariffs over the years, maybe like the dairy industry. How does it change the game if the tariffs get removed? And that's what's happened with the USMCA, which is NAFTA 2.0. So you have to understand that, especially if you're in the dairy industry. But if you're not, maybe it'll impact you, maybe it won't. The second one, global harmonization practices and standards. New technology and increasing complexity is leading to more harmonization of practices and standards. So it's one thing to get access to a trade, to trade with a country without tariffs, but then there are national standards. So for example, in Canada, we demand bilingual packaging with metric measures. Or in pharmaceuticals, everything has to be approved by Health Canada. Not just the Food and Drug Administration in the US, but Health Canada. So the FTA might allow for tariff-free trading, but if you don't repackage your goods or get your product approved by the right regulatory agency, you're done. You can't play. But as products get more complex, it's difficult for every country to have their own standards. So for example, in medical devices, the FDA, Health Canada, and the EU regulator are working together for common standards. So that makes it easier to trade. The third megatrend, the surge in e-commerce. Because of the lockdowns, we've all had to find different ways to spend our money and get the goods we want. E-commerce in some places have surged as much as 50%. And it's great, but it exposed many companies who had really nice front ends, but back ends that couldn't take with scaling up. So think about Home Depot and Lowe's. They are big companies with great front ends. Their website looks great. You order something for curbside pickup, it takes them 3 days to deliver or allow you to come pick it up. They struggled with the new demands. But on the other hand, there's companies like Ocado, a UK-based automated grocery distributor. They flourished. Their efficient robotic systems finally got tested and proved how good they are. So from what we know, once people get used to e-commerce, it won't go back. See, people like me at my age, once you try it, it takes a long time to convince me to try it, but once I get used to it, I'll probably do it over and over again. And then finally, on the last megatrend, the rethink on global supply and security. You know, it's fascinating how this has changed. We've all gotten used to the first megatrend, which is international trade. But during the pandemic, we realized it's not perfect. Maybe not every country who we trade with are our partners and buddies. We realized that sometimes it was more difficult to rely on the timing to get products that we need. Manufacturers couldn't get parts in a timely fashion. And worse still, some countries wouldn't let certain products leave their country. A great example with 3M. 3M Canada sold all sorts of N95 masks, but guess where they were produced? The US. And Donald Trump and his administration wouldn't let those products leave the US. Ironically, the pulp and paper that they're made out of came from Canada. So I would argue that there'll be a new definition of security which impacts supply chain going forward. And you might have heard about Ford cars or GM cars, that there are some microchips that are hard to get now. So a friend of mine just bought a brand new F-150 truck for 75,000 bucks. And when they tried to get the air conditioning to work, it'll work later, but they don't actually have the products to get the air conditioning working right now. So that's a problem with supply chain right now. So I tell you all this because when you go through the mega trends, look at your company and how it determine what impacts you, you might realize that, geez, I wish I didn't have all my eggs in one basket. I wish I didn't sell only in Canada, because basically Canada shut down. And you might say, well, geez, maybe I should have diversified my risk. Maybe I shouldn't just play in one country. And if you think about exporting and trade, you might think the US, because from the superficial, hey, they speak the same language. The culture seems pretty similar. There's 350 million people. Wow, what a great opportunity. And if you do business with them, you might realize that during the pandemic, they shut down too. So there is huge risk in being in one region. But what if you've been selling to Japan? Maybe you wouldn't have incurred the shutdown at the same time. Or if you had manufacturing in different regions. If one plant closed in Canada, maybe your plant in another part of the world would still be able to function. So diversification is a great way to reduce risk. Companies who have done it for ages, they manufacture products that they sell to different industries. That's their way of diversifying. But today, after the pandemic, I'm also saying that diversifying by selling into different regions might help. So don't just sell in Canada. Maybe don't just sell in North America, but where else? So Canada exports a lot. We're a trading nation. But our numbers are pretty interesting when you look at them. So if you look at how much we trade into the US, and I highlight that these are 2019 numbers. William's going to share some 2020 numbers, but these are 2019 numbers. It's goods and services that we export. And the number one trading partner is with the US, 443 billion, or 74% of what we trade. Here's the thing that blows me away. The number two trading area that we trade with is the EU. It's 50 billion, 8%. It's amazing. They're almost only 10% of number one. So they're number two, I agree, but number two by a long way. And China, where we get so many things like our technology and our smartphones and all that, we only export 24 billion to them. But I'm pretty certain that they export a lot to us. So there's a huge opportunity that we want to highlight. If you buy off that diversification will help you strategically to maximize your top line, minimize your risk, the comprehensive economic and trade agreement that was signed in 2016, brought into full force in 2017, it removes 98% of the tariffs to the EU. And they're the world's most important trading partners, not just measuring by number of people, but measured by number of people times their wealth and their consumption. And here's the cool thing. We have preferred access to this market. And yet Canadian companies have not been taking advantage of it. So if you're going to have to export somewhere, you think superficially the US is the easy one. And you think, oh, the EU, different language, different customs, different culture. It's harder. And maybe it is, but maybe you'll be better prepared than going down to the US thinking that they're the same. And there's so many Canadian companies that had their lunch handed back to them because they thought that way. But with that, let me pass it over to William. William, go ahead, introduce yourself a little bit about your background and proceed on.
Thanks very much, Glenn. So yeah, we're quite excited, and thank Communitech again for the opportunity to speak today. So a quick background on myself, and then we'll get into it because I have a lot of information I want to share with everyone. So I'm the lead in our international expansion practice within advisory services. So I work with entrepreneurs like yourselves across the country, whether it's technology, services, goods companies across industry. So that's really my focus, and really working with my colleagues like Ali, like Glenn, across the country and helping advance our entrepreneurs' interests, whether it's cross-border US, whether it's Europe, Asia, etc. So I'll share with you, again, the focus today is, as Glenn mapped out in terms of diversification, but we thought, again, because there's a lot of territory out there, we're going to have a focus on the European Union specifically. So today, for the rest of the presentation, I'll provide a drill down in terms of why this potentially could be a good market for you as you start thinking about maybe a US+1 strategy, or maybe for some companies that we deal with, it could potentially be that first market that you look at. Okay, so a quick update, and Glenn showed you some of the numbers specific to 2019, just to put it in context of pre-COVID. Just want to bring it up to date. When you look at this relationship, what does it look like based on last year's statistics? So about 5.5% of our goods go to the European Union, 28.7 billion, and EU 27. So again, this is not including the United Kingdom, which is, as we all know, part of the broader European Union previously. On the import side, it's still about 50 billion, so about 9% of our global imports of goods. Services, another 11.3 billion, so about close to 10% of our global exports. And I think for those of you in the technologies field, that's, I think, a particularly interesting number. And on the import side of that equation, about 11.7% of the import side of it. So as you can see, extremely dynamic relationship. And as Glenn mentioned, probably often companies underestimate, or maybe not as aware of, the degree of integration that we have with our European partners. On the direct investment side of it too, it reflects an extremely dynamic relationship. From a Canadian or EU direct investment in Canada, it's coming up close to $300 billion, representing about over 27% of global FDI in Canada. On the flip side of it, Canadian direct investment into the EU was about 230 billion. So if you look at it from a size perspective, we're definitely punching beyond our means relative to what the size of the EU is. But again, it's extremely interesting when we start looking at how much is played there, whether it's Germany, France, some of the Eastern European nations. So let's get into a little bit more. And I thought what would be useful is just provide the audience with a little context. I won't go into deep dive here, but sometimes there's not always a great understanding of what the EU is and isn't. So just wanted to give some quick snapshots. So 27 nations, or they call them member states, as we know, ranging from the Scandinavian nations through to Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, what is called the European Union. Not including, as we now know, our friends from the United Kingdom, at least part of it, I should say Britain, because we still have Ireland, as we know, in terms of the historical United Kingdom agreement. Next one, Glenn. And what's important to know too, and again, I don't want to make this a history lesson, but what's very important for everybody to understand too is the EU has a very unique character to it. It's started on the back of treaties. It started on the back of World War II and has built up over the years since that point. But it was really based on the concept of peace and prosperity. That's the foundation of what the EU is all about. And through our shared interests, as what previously were protagonists, we have shared interest in our economic development, our social development, our joint security, etc. So all of these, again, I won't go through them in detail, but just to give you an idea of that, when you think about the European Union, it's very unique in the world, much different than what we see with NAFTA 2.0, much different than other countries. More recently, and this is the exciting part too, like following the fall of the Berlin Wall, as you can see in this picture, and the fall of the Soviet Union, you saw this great expansion towards Eastern and Central Europe, Central Europe, I should say, 10 new nations. And then we added a couple more with Bulgaria and Romania, and most recently with Croatia. That took us up to 28 nations. And then more recently, as we all know, with Brexit, has taken it to the current 27. But again, when you think about it, think about peace and prosperity. That's what the European Union is founded on. It's not just about economics, it's about our joint and several relationships across many, many fronts. Just to put it in context, when you look at the EU today, it's about 446 million people compared to the giants of Asia, China 1.4, India coming on strong at 1.3, and comparatively with Japan, Russia, and the United States. So just to put it in context, it's larger as a bloc, even excluding the United Kingdom. Before it was over 500 million, but even without the Britain, you still have a community of close to 450 million population. But a key part of understanding the EU too is it's among those 27 nations, you have quite a wide swath of populations. As we can see here, Germany, the largest, about 83 million people, to the smallest of Malta at 500,000. What's interesting though, when you think about the member states, each of these countries have a voice. A member state is a member state. So the idea is that Germany can have excessive power relative to some of the other member state countries. But for you that may be thinking about the European Union, just remember 27 nations, all with very unique profiles, different populations, different economic profiles. And that's where it becomes very interesting when we start thinking about this region. And Glenn mentioned it before, is the cultural context. For those that have visited Europe, do business in Europe amongst the audience today, it is extremely diverse. And that's very much the exciting part of it. But also, as Glenn mentioned, something you need to consider, right? It is multilingual, multicultural. So if we're talking east, central, south, north, etc., you're going to be dealing with different communities. Again, it's English, luckily, is part of the sort of lingua franca of international, but depending on the countries, it may not be as prevalent, especially when you start getting to the east or maybe the north. Again, so it's part of the culture and part of the strength of the union. Next, Glenn. Quickly, as you know, everybody knows about the euro, but what's important too, when you look at the European Union, not all countries have the euro as its sovereign currency. In fact, some of the members like Sweden, Denmark, made a decision, and previously UK, when it opted out of the euro itself as a sovereign currency. Some of the other nations of Central and Eastern, they have to meet certain criteria before they can actually adopt the euro, and more or less to make sure that we have monetary stability in the region itself. But the idea here is over time, that's been part of the big European project. One core currency called the union or the euro that's allowed for more choice, better price stabilization, greater cooperation again between the EU countries itself. Okay. And another big element is what's called the single market. When you look at the history that I mentioned before, is one of the greatest accomplishments. And when I look at the history of the EU, because again, remember, these are countries that were at war with each other 75 years ago. So for them to come together and create what's called the European Union is phenomenal in recent history, or in fact, any history. And one of the key elements is what's called the single market. So if you're thinking about doing business with the euro or the European Union, understand the single market. That means goods, services, people, and capital can flow freely across those borders. That's much different than what we see here in North America, where we have the North America Free Trade Agreement, which is just about free flow of goods and services. What Europe has that we don't is the free flow of people, the free flow of capital, which is an exciting part. So when you think about any one market, sure, maybe our entry port is France, maybe it's Germany, but once you enter those countries, you now have this entire single market in front of you, which is multiple countries at the same time. So that's the EU. So let me take it back to just sort of the fundamentals. You're thinking about taking that big step. It's exciting. It's something new maybe for some of you. So yeah, the benefits are obvious. Like, why do we go there? Increased revenues, greater profitability, better competitive dynamics. Maybe we're diversifying our product line or taking different products to market, innovating. So these are the known benefits. But also on the next is the challenges, right? So we always talk about the upside, but from a risk management perspective, let's be aware of the challenges. Glenn, the next screen. And for you as entrepreneurs and business leaders, it's being aware too that yes, it isn't the United States, it isn't other parts of Canada, it is across the Atlantic. Again, nothing to stand in the way of promise, but yeah, there's a certain, for companies, we want to make sure that be ready in terms of your financial aspects, be ready for some of those cultural differences. Understand there's a different intensity of competition. There will be some different legal and regulatory requirements that you need to be sensitive to. There may be an HR, so we heard about the outpost. So absolutely, there's going to be elements of the human resource law that you need to be sensitive to, delivery and logistics, which market, and I'll get into that shortly in more detail, and who do we work with? So a lot of questions, but nothing insurmountable. These are the same kind of questions we throw at companies when they're talking about the United States, just that it's a little more diverse when we talk about Europe. So when you think about your expansion to Europe, really thinking about it from sort of three core pillars. One is what we call organizational, operational, and then financial. So really it's making sure that you and your company, it's not about the next deal so much as let's make sure that you have that foundation for growth, because it's a multi-year engagement. It's a multi-year endeavor. So usually year one, we tell companies, think about year one as foundation and then build from that standpoint. If Europe's your place, great, let's make it happen, but be ready to make sure that those different pillars are in place. Doesn't mean they have to be perfect, but beware that if there are too many gaps, that's what leads to lower sales than expected, or maybe you start, stop, have to retreat, etc. So we want to make sure that as you start thinking Europe, be ready. Okay, next one, Glenn. And that's really a balance act between what the market opportunity is. So I showed you some big numbers. Glenn showed some numbers too. Absolutely, it's a huge market. Before the UK dropped, actually, in terms of GDP terms, the European Union and the United States were about of a similar GDP in terms of overall size of market. Obviously, with the UK departing, it took a bit out of that number from the European Union, but in terms of population, in terms of GDP, it's very similar to what we see in the United States. So it's great potential, but going back to it from the internal, be ready for a different market with different dynamics. Again, Western industrialized, absolutely, but as we start going East Central, not quite the same, right? So just be ready. Exciting, but be ready for some of those differences. And so one of the things we often tell, and then we have the same perspective when we tell companies about the United States, it's too big to say European Union. So be ready to really start carving out, especially if you're new to the EU, okay, which country, which member state, not so much the entire European Union, or even if you're on the ground, maybe start going to a Germany +1 strategy or Germany +1+2 strategy. We want to make sure that as companies grow, especially SMEs, be ready to carve it out in a way that allows you to build that foundation. Because if you spread yourself too thin, and we see this over and over, that's where companies run into trouble. And we say the same thing if you go in the United States. It's too big to say US. It's really, let's carve it out to certain targeted markets, targeted states, targeted regions. And that's what builds success. So when you look at this, for us, it's a matter of, let's make sure we get a good balance between the opportunity of what the market's bearing and being aware of those risks that I highlighted before. And then when you start identifying, okay, let's analyze, let's research, let's understand what that balance is. Then you start mapping out, and this is something we use at BDC, is just to help companies think through where does it make sense to start? And then you start prioritizing. Maybe your first stop is France, maybe Germany, maybe Eastern European, don't know. But as you think about your business and you think about your growth trajectory to Europe, you want to go through this type of exercise, because again, it's not a pan-European strategy. It's more, let's get into the right market, and then let's leverage the single market for your development. Next one. And what do we think about when you start looking at that? So this is the EU GDP per capita. So again, at one extreme, and this is based on current prices here, euro per capita, you have Luxembourg. It's over 100,000 euros per capita. Then on the other extreme, we have Bulgaria at about 8,700 euros per capita. That's close to 100,000 euros difference between the wealthiest on a per capita and, I don't want to say poorest, but let's say least developed of the European countries, as is Romania. So, and the Western Europeans like Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, etc., they're on the left-hand side of that screen, right? So As you start mapping out your strategy, this may be one of the things that you start looking at. Is it an export destination, perhaps? As an investment destination, perhaps? Again, different factors will come into that. Next screen, Glenn. The other things too, of course, when we look at what's happening in Europe compared to the rest of the world, this is what we see in Canada, United States, and what's happening in Europe. Not too dissimilar, right, in terms of that V shape. UK got hit very hard, relatively speaking. France, almost as bad. The Eurozone. So relatively speaking, Europe got hit harder than we did in North America with COVID. But as we can see, the jump back, very similar, like France jumped back, it's stabilizing with what we see with the rest of North America. So from an opportunity perspective, and going back to what Glenn said, is there's opportunity there. They're following similar economic dynamics that we see within North America. And again, their growth rates in some of the key markets are aligned with what we see in North America. So again, a great alternative in terms of market diversification. And then again, it's just a matter of, where do we prioritize? Do we go after all markets at once? Again, no. What we suggest is prioritize, get your beachhead, or even if you're there, let's start building a Germany +1 or France +1 strategy, and then let's start building the market. Again, as we would suggest you do in the United States. How do you do that? Usually there's different forms of opportunities or means to get the market. It starts with your export mindset. If you're not already there, do we do it direct? And that's a function of your internal sales capacity. Do we use channel partners in terms of reps, agents, distributors? Again, depends on your product, but we find both, right? So depending on how you're structured as a company, that's a good starting point. But then depending on, again, your nature of your business model, you may start working towards JVs. You may start working towards eventually a wholly owned foreign enterprise, which is that direct investment in market, either through acquisition or maybe a greenfield investment. But really, as the idea here for us is get the foundation. If you're, before you start going to WOFE, which is the highest level of potential return, but also your highest level of risk, maybe take some steps, get to know the market, get to know the competition, get to know that single market that I mentioned, and then start building the bricks of growth in the European Union. But again, you have a lot of different options, but our recommendation is always, start in a more managed growth perspective, and then start going up the ladder as you get to know the market, competition, the opportunity, how it fits with those three pillars that I mentioned previously in terms of organizational, operational, and financial. Because if you get it right, it's exciting, great growth potential, but if you get it wrong, it can be very painful. And again, not just Europe, any market. Okay. So I know that's a lot. I don't know if we're going to be sharing these presentations with everybody, but yeah, we're excited about your interest in the European Union market diversification. So let's throw it out. I know we don't have a lot of time, but we covered a lot of ground, but let's throw it out to some questions and comments.
Great. Thank you, William. Quite exciting and a lot of numbers and what makes sense. And when you look at the big picture, you realize how much opportunity you have. One of the things that you mentioned, and maybe I get the ball rolling with some quick questions until others come up with their comments and questions. You did mention a starting point and a beachhead strategy, and many companies around us started with making Germany, France, and Britain kind of that beachhead, and they brownfield, greenfield, or other ways. They started to expand their expansion to European market from that perspective. Now with Brexit, things are a little bit different. So what would be the impact for those companies, or the new ones are looking into having their first footing, if you wish, in the context of the market?
It's a great question, Ali. It's a hard one. As anybody who's been following the Brexit, let's call it the divorce, Britain from the European Union, it's an like most divorces, probably a little acrimonious, right? And it was no different here. And it was a painful separation and divorce between the two historical trading partners. So what's happened is on January 1st, 2020, there was a deadline. So that's the official date that, the UK or Britain, I'm going to say Britain again, because UK includes Ireland, which is still a part of the European Union, right? So it's Britain and thus Brexit. And what next step was, they said up until the end of last year, it was governed under the same terms as the previous agreement, under the EU agreement. As of this year now, they've been negotiating the terms. It's still not finalized all of the details, but there is a new umbrella agreement that's governing the relationship going forward. But they do not have they don't have the customs agreement anymore. We don't have, there's issues of value-added tax that changed. We have issues of sanitary and phytosanitary measures that now have to be considered, that the things that they had advantage with the single market, they don't have that anymore. For those that have investments, and it's actually a good point to bring up too, is if I had investment in the UK with the idea that I'm going to get into the European Union through that channel, you got to take a serious look now at how that has impacted your business or potential business. So in terms of both trade and investment flows, the UK doesn't have, or Britain, I should say, Britain does not have those same doors and benefits that they used to. So for Canadian enterprises too, it's interesting. So the Canada, up until, so an agreement was until with Brexit too, that Canada, the UK agreed to utilize the same umbrella agreement that we have with the EU. So the agreement that we had with a broad EU basically is a separate agreement, but under the same general terms and conditions with the UK now, or Britain, right? So you don't lose that advantage. The big difference is between Britain and Europe. That's the big change. For you as a company though, if you were using Britain as your door to the EU, that's where you have to take a step back and figure out the legal, the taxation, all of those elements, and how it impacts your business on a go-forward basis.
That makes sense. Thanks for that. Glenn, maybe we have time for one question to you, and then we pass it back to Christina from there. So you mentioned diversification, and I think it, as a general context, is a very good approach. But I get the question, how much diversification is enough? And how should I look at it? And what is the right balance between things? Can you expand on that a little bit as what we look at and what do you have in mind?
Yeah, and Ali, I wish it was more science than art, but I'm going to tell you it's art. So it's actually a balance that you have to find between enough diversification to minimize your risk, but not so much that you actually diversify all your resources. And if you diversify your resources too much, you're probably the furthest thing away from being strategic. And what's important for companies who are growing is that they actually need to do a couple things really, really well, as opposed to a lot of things in a mediocre way, not because they want to do it that way, but because they spread their resources out too widely.
Correct. Okay, so the real decision point there is what resources we have, how much load we have on them, and how they can function best and be most effective. Yep. Okay, thanks folks for that. Hopefully the room got some insight from this conversation. Christina, with that, I pass it back to yourself.
Yes, thank you. So as we wrap up today, I just wanted to thank our three guests, Ali, William, and Glenn, for your time today and your expertise that you've shared with us. To our audience, thank you for joining. We hope to see you again. Have a great week, everyone. And we'll be following up with an email, and we can share that presentation out too if that would be helpful. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Bye.
See you later,
Thanks
everyone.
for having us.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.